with fresh air because I don't want anybody going to sleep while I talk. He said turn both switches on, but there's only one switch. Is this on? Is it? Yeah, it's on. I can tell that. I'm going to have to yield to the temptation to add a little bit to that story that Colin just told you. It is true that things were very, very different in those days. Nobody really seemed to be quite brave enough to do what needed to be done. And this was impressed upon me when I flew into Sydney without letting anybody in the States know where I had gone. I had arranged with my associate pastor in Loma Linda to speak on Sabbath morning in my behalf and to simply announce that Elder Larson is in Australia this weekend speaking at a Righteousness by Faith convention. Well, he did that. As I said, I arrived at the airport in Sydney, and I waited while somebody looked for me. They finally found me standing off to one side of the terminal waiting room, and I was interested in the fact that the folk who picked me up, relatives by marriage of Dr. Standish, they looked all around and they said, "Fine, nobody has seen us. Let's go out this door right here." Well, I thought, what kind of cloak and dagger stuff is this anyway? Well, we got outside and they said, "We're going to get you in the car. We're going to take you over to the beach where there's a house where we can keep you until Friday, and then we'll take you up to the campground and nobody will see you at the beach." And I began to think, what is this anyway? So we did that. And the second day in the little house at the beach, I took a walk. I guess I was going about an hour, and when I came back to the house, the brother who was in charge there was sitting in a chair in the front room, and he was as white as a ghost, and he was literally trembling. And he said, "Oh, Brother Larson, something terrible has happened." I said, "What is it?" "There's a telephone call for you from the States, and I know it's the General Conference President who's going to order you to not speak to us down here. What shall we ever do?" I said, "Look, if the operator calls again, you tell her Ralph Larson is on vacation and he doesn't want to be bothered with any telephone calls." He said, "Would you do that?" I said, "I would do that." "Oh," he said, "it's all right." Well, Friday afternoon we drove up, and I got there Friday evening. The Vision Valley Campgrounds was a country camp, you understand, a sort of a resort area, and they said, "Now we'll put you in this room right here. You stay right there until we come and get you. Nobody will see you here." So finally, when the meeting time came, they came and led me into the place, and I learned that they had told the people somebody from America was coming, but they hadn't told them who, and they were desperately afraid that somebody was going to order the whole thing to stop. Well, folks, back at that time, you can't really understand how different it was. To help you to see that point, just a few weeks or months back, I don't know exactly when, but this year anyway, we were at camp meeting in Kansas, and it just so happened that they called all of the ministry leaders up to the platform that evening, and I looked around there and I thought, what has God wrought? When Gene and I, in Loma Linda, in the fall of the year 1977, finally caught on to what the apostasy amounted to and what it was doing, and we took a public stand against it right there in Loma Linda, we felt very, very much alone. One of the very first things we did was contacted Colin Standish. He told us about his brother Russell, and we managed to catch Russell. He was coming through California, and brought him down to speak to our group down there, to give us some insights as to what was happening down in Australia, and from there up to the States. But when we took a public stand, you could look out all the way across North America and you could hardly see anybody standing publicly anywhere. There were people, of course, silently holding to the truth, but we hadn't met them, we didn't know who they were. But now, there are ministries cropping up all over the place. People all over the place are rising up and saying, "I'm going to do something about this," and they start a ministry, and they start holding seminars, they start holding camp meetings, and we counted 25 ministry leaders sitting there in various parts of the tent that evening, and I thought, what hath God wrought? Folks, I want to tell you this historic Adventist movement is growing growing by leaps and bounds, not only here but in other places as well. But now to our message for this evening. I see faces here that I recognize from other places, and I guess I really ought to explain to you that I've been asked to present certain messages here. And also, as I survey the rapidly changing situation, I prepare messages that I think our people need to hear, and I keep repeating them as I go around. So some of you, I'm afraid, may hear something you've heard before, but maybe that won't hurt you. If you just grit your teeth and bear it, maybe you'll be all right. Our subject for tonight, the subject of our study for tonight is, If You Were God. We want to start with that beautiful verse, Luke 21:28, which was used as our scripture this evening. Jesus said, "When these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your head, for your redemption draweth nigh." Now, the things that he described wouldn't make anybody look up and lift up their heads, because they were not very nice things. They were earthquakes and tidal waves and famines and pestilences and wars. That's the kind of thing he had been talking about. So the things in themselves were not pleasant, but the light through the darkness was that they established a time frame. They told them where they were in the stream of time. When these things begin to come to pass, you know that the second coming of Christ is near. And I believe this is the kind of a message and the kind of a thought that we need to reflect about this evening. The things that we are finding happening in the world and in the church today wouldn't make any of us happy. It would be a heavy burden on our hearts, and we would be hopelessly discouraged if it were not for the fact that we had been told in advance all about how this was going to happen and how it's going to end. And when we see these things coming to pass, we know that the end is near. I'll give you a bit more on that near the close of the study this evening. Now, the subject, If You Were God, you see. This is intended to be a thought-provoking message that will help you to think through some things that I believe we need to be thinking through. Please pardon my notebook here. This is what happens as one grows a little older. Jean tells me I shouldn't advertise my age, so I'm not going to let anybody know how old I am, but I'm pretty old. There was a time when I hardly bothered with notes, but there's a time also when it's wise to have notes on the platform before you. So I have some here. You see, we have strange things happening in the world today, and stranger things, if I may say so, even stranger things happening in the church. Evangelism, page 221, you find a section entitled The Sanctuary Truth. It's about 10 pages long, and it's divided in two sections. 2 points are brought forth here very, very clearly. Number one, the sanctuary is the very heart and soul of our message. And number two, the sanctuary will be fiercely attacked as we near the end of time. Now, those two things are very clearly set before you here. Evangelism, pages 221, 22. Let me just pick up a few lines. The correct understanding of the ministration in the heavenly sanctuary is the foundation of our faith, the very foundation of our faith. We all need to have a knowledge of it, she writes. The sanctuary in heaven is the very center of Christ's work in behalf of men. We're going to have a lot to say about Christ and his work this weekend. It concerns every soul living upon the earth. It opens to view the plan of redemption, bringing us down to the very close of time, revealing the triumphant issue of the contest between righteousness and sin. The subject of the sanctuary was the key which unlocked the mystery of the disappointment of 1844. It opened to view a complete system of truth, connected and harmonious. I hope you will pick up that line and register it in your mind. A complete system of truth, connected and harmonious. We are one of the very few organizations on earth, if not the only one, who have no internal self-contradictions in our theology. People go to heaven when they die, and they're going to be judged at the end of time. You know, the nonsense that you get into. Self-contradiction in theological systems. A complete system of truth, connected and harmonious. She says, the great waymarks we have passed are immovable. These pillars of truth stand as firm as the eternal hills. Then she goes on to say that our doctrine of the sanctuary will be fiercely attacked as we near the end of time. Now, as we think about this, I want you to think a little bit about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul had an interesting personality. He had a brilliant mind, a great mind, one of the greatest minds of all time, we believe. And he had a great understanding of God's grand design. The plan of salvation in all of its majesty, all of its grandeur was always in his thinking. And you will notice that when they brought to Paul a common nitty-gritty question about some prosaic problem, he didn't answer them on the same level. He would take the question, as it were, and look at it and say, now do you see the grand design of God? This fits into it right here. He was always looking at God's grand design. For example, now let me just show you a little bit of what I'm talking about. Romans chapter 14, verses 7 to 10. They brought to him a question about days and about foods. Romans chapter 14, verses 7 to 10. Notice how he answers in verse 7 to 10. For none of us liveth to himself, and no man dieth to himself. For whether we live unto the Lord, and whether we die unto the Lord. Whether we live therefore or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ both died and rose and revived, that he might be the Lord both of the dead and the living. You see what he's doing? He's saying, now folks, look at the grand design of God. Get this great, big, beautiful picture before your mind. And this question that you've brought me fits into it right here, the truth right there. It's part of the grand design, you see. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, just a little bit further in the Bible. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, there was a problem about divisions. And notice how he answers this particular question in verse 13. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were ye baptized in the name of Paul? See how he invites them to get their minds on the great big picture that they're thinking about. Chapter 3, of course, we recognize this quickly. We're familiar with this. They brought him a question about purity and impurity. And he writes in verse 16, Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy. For the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. This is the highest concept of Christian health to be found anywhere on earth. And then chapter 6 again, verse 19. What, know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own? For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God. So when you're looking at this food or this action or that action, get your eyes on the grand design. Get your eyes on the grand design. God has a grand design, and your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. That's where it all begins, and that's where it ought to end. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, they brought to him a question about order in the church, and he answers with the majestic cadences of chapter 13. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. Though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing, and so on, through that magnificent chapter, which has been called one of the greatest pieces of writing to come from the mind of any man in the Western world, and I believe that's what it is. So what I'm trying to show you, folks, is how Paul handled questions. Paul was always looking at the majestic, grand design of God, the great, glorious plan of salvation. And what I'm wanting to consider with you tonight is, can we do the same thing? Can we find the place in that grand design of God for the sanctuary doctrine? Does it really have a place there, or is it something unnecessary that we can casually lay aside and forget all about it? Is it an essential, integral part of the grand design of God? That's what I want us to reflect about this evening, if we may. Let's see if we can do that. God's grand design, of course, is the proposed solution to the problem of evil, the problem of good and evil. And this is as old as time itself almost. There hadn't been very much time pass in this world before the problem arose. And so it's an old question. It has been examined by many, and most recently, or very, very recently, would you believe, by Time magazine. You wouldn't expect to find it there. I wonder if you can see this cover of Time magazine. Rather looks as if they had an accident in the printing department, doesn't it? But if I hold it right, and if you look carefully, you'll see a word there. Can you see it? What is the word? Evil, that's right. And so Lance Morrow, who does quite a bit of writing for Time, wrote a feature article on the subject of good and evil, and he did a very good job of describing the problem, but he offered no solution at all. He left us dangling hopelessly. He says here on page 51 of this issue of Time magazine, this is June 10, 1991. He quotes Frederick Buechner, a theologian, who puts it like this. You have three propositions before you. Number one, God is all-powerful. Number two, God is all good. Number three, terrible things happen. And he says there's no way you can make sense out of that, no way you can harmonize that, because if God is all good and God is all powerful, why do terrible things happen? Well, as I say, he offers us no solution. And he says you cannot harmonize those, but with all due respect and with deep sympathy, we have to disagree. We say, yes, you can harmonize those. If you take the great profound truths of God's grand design and register them in your mind and appreciate them and internalize them and recognize them for what they are. Sometimes in just a few simple words you get a tremendous truth expressed. For example, 1 John chapter 4 verse 8. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. Now that is one of the most profound statements in the entire Bible. And if you start with that, you can finally work out a harmony between these three propositions. And that's what I'm asking you to imagine that you're going to do tonight when I give you this title, If You Were God. Sometimes we hear people say something that's very unreasonable, and you or I might have sometimes been guilty of saying that ourselves. Isn't it too bad that we know so little about God? Now I say that's a very unreasonable question, a very unreasonable statement, because we know a lot about love. And if God is love, everything that is true about love is true about God. Wouldn't you have to accept that? And so when we know so much about love as we do, we see it before us all the while. We know what love accepts and we know what love rejects. We know what love will endure and we know what love turns away from. We know a lot about love because we see it in action before us all the time. And everything that is true about love is true about God because God is love. Therefore I say we know a lot about God. We really know all we need to know about God if we just apply that. Sometime do a little exercise of your own. Take a large piece of paper and make a list of all of the things that occur to you that we know about love and write them down on the paper. When you've got that done, sit and look at it for a few minutes, and I believe it will occur to you that you are looking at a list of the doctrines of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Because every doctrine that we hold is simply an answer to the question, what would love do about this? Or what would love do about that? From the first study in Daniel chapter 2, clear down past the mark of the beast and the unpardonable sin, to the very end, every single doctrine that we hold is simply an answer to the question, what would love do about this particular problem? And so love is the theme of all of our theological principles. And when any theological principle or idea is presented before us, the first thing we do is test it for its love content. And if it doesn't pass that test, we have no further interest in it. It has to be part of the picture of God's love. Otherwise, we cannot take any interest in it whatsoever. And so our theology, Gene and I have conducted many evangelistic campaigns in which we propose on the opening night that we're going to give 21 lectures on the love of God, and that this will by no means exhaust the subject, and we invite the people every night to make it the very first thing that we do when I step into the pulpit is we all recite together 1 John 4:8. sometimes in their language, sometimes in ours, or whatever it may be. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. And so we enjoy that very, very much, showing the people that we're just talking about love all the way through. We're talking about God, and God is love. Now, go back to your list. You've written this list of things on the big piece of paper that I suggested to you. And look it over, and I think you would put very, very close to the beginning, if not at the very beginning, one thing we know about love is that love rejects solitude. Love does not want to be alone. Love cannot be alone. If there's only one person, how can there be love? There have to be two. We had to do quite a bit of counseling in our term of pastorating in Loma Linda. A lot of young people there, you know, with young people's problems. One particular young lady talked to me quite a bit about her particular problem, her, shall we say, her romantic problems, which appeared to have no good solution. When we had gone from there to the Philippine Islands and been there for several months, we got a letter from her, a very happy, joyful letter. She said, "Elder Larson, rejoice with me. I'm in love." Well, of course, we rejoiced with her, and we wrote back and we said, "We want to know who is the lucky man." Now, just suppose that she had written back to us in response to that question, "Who is the lucky man?" and said, "What do you mean, lucky man? There isn't any lucky man. I'm not in love with anybody. I'm just in love." Well, you see, that's kind of weird, isn't it? I'd say it's a lot worse than that. You just can't have love unless you have two. Love rejects solitude. Love does not want to be alone. Gene and I were making one of our many trips across the nation, like we did today. We left home at 4 o'clock this morning, I hope you understand. And I guess we should have left at 3:30 because we almost didn't make it. But anyway, we were flying across the country, and I found myself sitting beside a young lady who was a medical student in a university. And as quick as she found out that I am a theologian of sorts, she began to press me with questions. It seemed that she and some friends had spent the entire weekend in Florida together discussing the question, how can we know if there is any God or not? Well, I asked her to start with this: God is love. And I presented this question to her. If you were God, and if your very nature is love, and there's nothing else in the whole universe but you, just you in empty space, how long would you be satisfied and contented with that if you are love? She said immediately, not very long. Not very long, of course not. And so I'm asking you tonight to go through that little routine with me also. Imagine that you are God insofar as it's proper to think of beginnings with God. We know that we have to use human language. You know that we can communicate one with another, but our minds cannot take in the magnitude of God in all eternity. So let's just, for the sake of human illustration, say you are God, you are the Creator, you have the power to do anything you want to do, but nothing has been done yet. There is nothing in all the universe except you and empty space. Would you be content with that solitude very long if your very nature is love? I don't think you would. You'd have to do something about it. And so you'd say, well, I'll start creating. And you create suns, stars, galaxies, what we used to call island universes. They are so vast. They call them galaxies more now, on the basis that there's really only one universe. And you send them out on orbits, circling through space, and they come back right on time, and they just have all the majestic glory that we see out there in space. Have you solved your problem of solitude, or are you still alone? For all practical purposes, you're still alone, are you not? So you say, I will take another step. I will create plant life on planets. And so the grass grows, and the flowers bloom, and the bushes rise up, and the trees tower in their glory, and the fruit appears. And all of this is very, very beautiful, very, very satisfying. But have you solved your problem of solitude, or are you still alone? You're still alone, aren't you? So you say, well, I'll go another step further. I will create animal life. And I will give to the animals more options, more freedom than I give to the plants. Plants have really no options. You understand that, don't you? Plants are governed entirely by mechanical law, and there's no escape from that at all. When the sun says to the flower in the morning, turn your face toward me, can the flower say, I don't feel like it today, I'm going to turn my face the other way? Oh, no. The plants are governed entirely by mechanical law. No options at all. So you say, I will give a little bit more freedom and options to these animals. Options meaning choices, freedom of choice. And we see that, and that does make a little bit of a change. You can get some affection from a dog. People argue about whether there's any affection in the heart of a cat. I'm sure I don't know. But dogs, we do know, can develop a remarkable degree of affection for their owner so that they would even reject another dog in favor of their owner, which is remarkable, you'll have to admit. Well, this helps, but does it really satisfy? Have you really solved your problem of solitude yet, or are you still, for all intents and purposes, alone? You know the answer, you're still alone. And so, upon reflection, now that's a silly word, isn't it? We don't talk about God reflecting. He doesn't need to reflect, he knows, but we're trying to talk about God in language that human beings can understand. I explained that before. So you say, well, I see that in order to ever have love that's like my love, a returning of the affection that I feel for others, I will have to create people with all options, full freedom, full power of choice. As we all know that there cannot be love without freedom. Love cannot be forced. Supposing that you are a student in the university and you decide that you would like to write a doctoral dissertation on the subject of love, and you approach your professors and they say, well, that's a great idea, you go right ahead and do that. And so you say, well, there's only one little problem. I've never been in love, I don't know anything about love on a personal basis, so how can I write a lot about it? And the professor says, no problem, just go stand on the street corner and watch the ladies go by. And one comes along that appeals to you, grab her by the hair and drag her home and force your attentions upon her and sit down and write about love. Would that be sensible? What would he know about love? Nothing at all. Love cannot be forced. Love has to be freely given. There has to be freedom before there can be love. So you now are ready to take that decision, make that decision and take that step. I will create beings like myself and I will give them full freedom. Take it easy now. Are you sure you want to do that? You'd better think it all through from the beginning to the end. It's going to be a wonderful thing when they respond to your freely given love with equally freely given love, and you have fellowship with beings that can really fellowship with you. That's going to be sweet and lovely and marvelous and wonderful. But it might not always happen like that. What if somebody sometime uses that freedom that you have given to turn against you, to rebel against you? He chooses not to love you. What would you do about that? Oh, you say, no problem. I'm the creator. I can read his heart. I can know what's going on inside his mind before anybody else knows, and when I see that rebellious attitude developing, I'll just zap him out of existence and it'll be all over just like that. Would it really be all over just like that? Aren't there people who love that one? Aren't they going to have questions? You have dealt with the problem before it was apparent to them. So they have no idea why you zapped him out of existence. Can you imagine? Two angels meeting on the streets of glory, and one saying to another, where's Lucifer? I haven't seen him around for a long time. And the other one says, Lucifer? Well, there isn't any Lucifer anymore. God killed him. Wiped him out. He doesn't exist anymore. Why did God do that? Well, we don't really understand. God said there was some mysterious thing wrong inside his heart. We don't know what it is. He calls it sin. What it is, we don't know. But he said it was very bad and it's inside his heart, so he had to kill him. I didn't see anything wrong with Lucifer. Oh, I better watch out, he'll kill me too. That's what you'd have. That's what you'd have. And the whole program would be a failure, would it not? So, you better think it through before you take that step of creating beings with freedom. You'd better think it through very carefully. Ellen White writes in Great Controversy, page 497, until fully developed, sin would not appear the evil thing that it is. Until fully developed, you'd have to let people see what that thing called sin is before you wipe people out who have it. Which means you're talking about time now. You're going to have to give that plant of sin time to develop. And talking about plants makes me think of this. Supposing you have a plant in your backyard. You see it growing and unfolding its leaves, and as you step out there one morning, you say, that's a horrible weed, I must get rid of it. Quickly, you get your shovel and start to dig it out. Just then your wife comes out the door and she says, what are you doing? I have to get rid of this terrible weed. Weed, that's a flower. Now, you've got a problem. What's the best solution to that problem? Why, it occurs to you quickly, does it not? You're bigger than she is. You can push her aside and take it out anyway, but will that be the end of the problem? Oh, no. You're going to hear about that again. You just let it grow. Let it grow long enough so that everybody can see what it is. Then you can take it out and there won't be any more problem, right? And that's what God has to do with the problem of sin, but that creates another problem. If you have to let the plant of sin grow for a while in order that people can see what it is, that's going to give this rebel time to work out a lot of accusations against you. Wherein does God deny himself? He tells us self-denial is a virtue. Have you noticed him practicing any self-denial? Look at him. He sits on his throne while we bow down before him and worship. Is that self-denial? Wherein does God practice self-denial? And the next part, what about this law that he's given to us? He couldn't keep that law himself if he were in our position. What would you do with accusations like that? Good. Arguing wouldn't help, would it? You'd have to prove it. You would have to prove it. You would have to demonstrate that you know how to practice self-denial. You would have to prove that you could keep your law, that it's not an unfair law, that it's not an oppressive law, that it is truly a law of love. Did it ever occur to you folks that the Ten Commandments are nothing but God's happiness code? That's all they are. How could two people on one planet be happy if one steals from the other, if one lies to the other, and so on down the line? The Ten Commandments are just the principles of happiness, the principles of love. That's all they are. How to keep them happy. Okay, now, have you thought this all through? No, you haven't. You haven't thought about your worst problem yet. Your worst problem yet is this. What if somebody rebels and then repents of his rebellion? He thinks better of it. He wises up. He realizes that was a great mistake. He asks for forgiveness, and he becomes so loyal to you that he would die for you. Now you've really got a problem. He has violated the principles of life, and he must die. But he's repented. You're just going to say, sorry about that, I have to kill you anyway, and wipe him out? What would all of those free minds that you have created say about that? They'd say that's not fair. Well, let's see. Could you ask another human being who has never sinned, shall we say, this is theory of course, we say to him, now you have nothing to die for, but you go give your life for this repentant rebel so he can live. How would that go across with other people? Not very well, would it? Would you say to an angel, here, you have never sinned, you go down and give your life for him so he can live, but you will die? Would that be fair? You see, you've painted yourself into a corner, haven't you? There's only one way that question can be answered. There's only one way that problem can be solved. You have to do it yourself. You have to go down there and show people that you know how to practice self-denial. You have to show people that you can obey God's law with the power that he freely gives. It's not a problem. Then you have to give your life to pay the price for the repentant rebel. You still think you want to go that way? You are the Creator. You still think that's what you want to do? I really believe that on a moment's reflection, the answer would come out, yes, I believe you would do it. Not only because of the principles of your nature being love, that would impel you toward doing it, but also because of such things as we read in Great Controversy, page 675. The understanding that you have of what it will be like when the problem of sin is all over. In the Bible, the inheritance of the saved is called a country. There the heavenly shepherd leads his flock to fountains of living waters. The tree of life yields its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree are for the service of the nations. There are ever-flowing streams, clear as crystal, and beside them waving trees cast their shadows upon the paths prepared for the ransomed of the Lord. There the wide-spreading plains swell into hills of beauty, and the mountains of God rear their lofty summits. On those peaceful plains, beside those living streams, God's people, so long pilgrims and wanderers, shall find a home. I believe that the answer is yes, you would do it, because your nature is love, and because you have your eyes on that beautiful vision of what it's going to be like when it's all over. Now you're saying, hey, Brother Larson, didn't you say we're going to talk about the sanctuary tonight? Yes. That's what we've been talking about ever since we started. We're talking about the sanctuary, God's grand design. In God's grand design, where does the sanctuary fit in? Just one more question, I think, will settle that in your minds. If you have recognized that you are the one who has to deal with the problem of sin, if you have recognized that you are going to have to go down there and give your demonstrations and then give your life, here's your next question. When would you do it? Or you say, immediately. As soon as the first sin appears, I would be right there and take care of it. Now wait a minute. We have already read that until fully developed, sin would not appear as the evil thing that it is. We've already decided that you're going to have to give that plant time to grow and show its true nature. And so as soon as it appears, you go there and make your sacrifice, give your demonstration. And 4,000 years later, people looking back at that, you know what they're going to say, don't you? I can see how that helped those people back there, but what does that have to do with me? I'm not like them. 4,000 years of declining in the powers of the human race. Sure, that did something for that generation, but my generation, that didn't do anything for us. You see the problem? So you're going to have to wait until the conditions in the world have reached an all-time low. And Ellen White writes about that in Desire of Ages, page 36. Here she writes about conditions in the world when Christ came to give his demonstration. She says, bewildered and deceived, people were moving on in gloomy procession toward eternal ruin, to a death in which is no hope of life, toward night to which comes no morning. Satanic agencies were incorporated with men. The bodies of human beings, made for the dwelling place of God, had become the habitation of demons. The senses, the nerves, the passions, the organs of men were worked by supernatural agencies in the indulgence of the vilest lust. The very stamp of demons was impressed upon the countenances of men. Human faces reflected the expression of the legions of evil with which they were possessed. A.T. Jones, commenting on that, said that although some people think of the history of man as down, 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 that he did not think that our present age would compare with the age of Christ in the evils that were in the world. And I think he's right. We do not see that massive devil possession in our time that we read about in the New Testament, do we? At least not very much, if at all. And so you wait until humanity has reached down into its lowest level before you come, and there are lots of advantages there. You've solved a lot of problems there. You've answered a lot of questions there. But now let's turn the thing around the other way. What about the people who live way back there, born and live and die before you come, centuries before you come? What about them? How are they going to benefit from what you do 4,000 years later? That's the sanctuary. Do you see? That's the sanctuary. That's the place of the sanctuary in God's grand design. It fits in right there to answer that question. Those people, thousands of years before you come, have been taught that they can go to the flock and take a lamb, a faultless, unblemished lamb. They can bring that lamb to the sanctuary, lay their hands on the head of the lamb and confess their sins, and then slay the lamb. Instead of the sinner dying, the lamb dies. And in doing this, they enter into God's grand design. They step into it. They step into the plan of salvation. And so they get the full benefits of it right then and right there. That's the place of the sanctuary in God's grand design. It has to be there. Now, we need to introduce a word here which helps us understand this. The word is proleptic, P-R-O-L-E-P-T-I-C. You ought to look that up in your dictionary. It's there. It's a good word. We don't use it very much, but here we find it fits exactly what we're talking about. It's borrowed from the Greek pro, which means before, and the Greek lambano, which means to take or receive. And so your dictionary will tell you, at least my dictionary puts it like this, that the word proleptic means that you are treating a future event as if it had already occurred. You see? Treating a future event as if it had already occurred. And that's what gives validity to what you're doing now, is that future event that's going to happen. Think of it like this. We have our election for the president in this country in November. We elect a president, we call him the president-elect, but he is not inaugurated until January. Now what's he doing between November and January? He's a very busy man. He's calling people in different parts of the country and asking them, come and be part of my program, my cabinet, my advisors, this, that, or the other thing. Will you be my Secretary of Commerce? Will you be my Secretary of State? If they accept the invitation, they resign from their positions, they dispose of their property in some fashion, and they make the move to Washington to be ready to go to work on the very next morning after the inauguration ceremony is completed. But now, what would happen to all of those people if on the night before inauguration the president was killed in an automobile accident? What would happen to all of those people? The whole thing would be canceled out. All of their appointments would be meaningless, would have no validity whatsoever. They'd have to do their best to go back and pick up where they left off and get back again into the program they had. It wouldn't be so easy, would it? That's what proleptically means, and that's what the sanctuary is. It has to be there. Now, another thing that we must recognize on this, and I must hurry on, and this is very, very important. This is one of the most important parts of what I'm telling you tonight. Unless there is a future event, a real future event, do these things that are done proleptically have any validity at all? Certainly not. Does that sacrificing of a lamb really do anything for you unless Christ dies on the cross? Of course not. Now, watch closely. The sacrifice of the lamb is proleptic. It has validity only because there is a sacrifice on the cross. Now, after the lamb is sacrificed, there's something else that has to happen. The priest has to take that blood into the sanctuary and perform his ministry, his priestly ministry. That's part of the program. If you read through Leviticus, you find it is not until the priest has done this that the atonement is completed. Does that priestly ministry have any validity unless there is a priestly ministry of Christ in heaven? Certainly not. The whole thing would be utter nonsense. There has to be a future event, a genuine, a real future event, to justify either the sacrifice or the priestly ministry. And so when we meet somebody who tells us there is no priestly ministry of Christ in heaven today, you tell them, look, you're wiping out the whole plan of salvation. All of those people who put their faith in those lambs and those sacrifices will find that that was utterly without value unless there is a real priestly ministry of Christ. And one more thing. I'm struggling against my clock here. One more thing. The sacrifice is done proleptically. Its validity depends upon a future sacrifice. The priestly ministry is done proleptically. Its validity depends upon a future priestly ministry. And one more thing. The inauguration, the dedication of the sanctuary was likewise done proleptically. It has no virtue, no validity unless there is a real inauguration of the heavenly sanctuary. Remember Daniel 9:25? Where the angel said to Daniel that the chosen one, was going to do a lot of things to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. To anoint the most holy. People sometimes, I did this myself in my early days, jump to the easy conclusion that the most holy is Jesus, but that's impossible. It's a neuter word and it cannot apply to a human being at all. It has to be a place or a thing. In the Hebrew language it says to anoint a holy of holies. And so Jesus had to inaugurate the heavenly sanctuary. Jesus had to perform that ministry of inauguration before the ministry of the sacrifices could begin. If you'd like to turn to Leviticus chapters 8 and 9. You find a description of the anointing of the heavenly sanctuary. You will find there, if you read carefully through chapters 8 and 9, that Moses took a special oil called the anointing oil, and he took blood, and that's commented on in Hebrews 9:21. And he anointed everything in the sanctuary, and then he sprinkled blood on the garments of the priest. Look at the last few verses of chapter 8, verse 30. And Moses took of the anointing oil and of the blood which was upon the altar, and sprinkled it upon Aaron and upon his garments and upon his sons and upon his sons' garments with him. Now I want you to look at that closely. Sprinkled it upon his garments. That's very important. Why? Because there are those who have been trying to tell us and are today trying to tell us that this statement proves that Ellen White said that the second apartment ministry, the most holy place apartment of ministry of Christ, began in AD 31 because he went into the most holy place and sprinkled blood upon the garments. Now look, folks, only once in all time was there any blood sprinkled upon the garments of the priest. Only once. That was the time of the inauguration. That had nothing whatever to do with the services of the sanctuary. Now notice verse 33. Ye shall not go out of the door of the tabernacle of the congregation in 7 days until your consecration be at an end. For 7 days shall he consecrate you. 7 days the inauguration took place, the consecration took place. Chapter 9. Came to pass on the 8th day. Then it describes the ceremonies that were put in motion on the 8th day, the day after the 7 days of consecration were completed. And the last part of chapter 9 says in verse 22, Aaron lifted up his hand toward the people and blessed them, and came down from offering of the sin offering and the burnt offering and peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle of the congregation and came out and blessed the people. And the glory of the Lord appeared unto all the people, and there came a fire out from before the Lord, and consumed upon the altar the burnt offering and the fat, which when all the people saw, they shouted and fell on their faces. Now go to Acts chapter 1, if you will. Acts chapter 1, the first few verses. The former treatise have I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and teach, until the day in which he was taken up. After that he through the Holy Ghost had given commandments unto the apostles whom he had chosen, to whom also he showed himself alive after his passion by many infallible proofs, being seen of them 40 days. Now that was 40 days from Passover. He was crucified at the Passover time. Ellen White says that they spent 10 days in the upper room after these 40 days were finished. And when the 10 days were finished, what happened? You know what happened. Acts chapter 1 and 2 tell you about it. Chapter 2, when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. Suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat upon each of them. While the disciples were in the upper room, what do you think Jesus was doing? He had plenty of time for that 7 days of inauguration of the most holy. Daniel 9:25, he shall anoint the most holy. And if you read Acts of the Apostles, page 55, page 38, pardon me, Acts of the Apostles, pages 38 and 39. When Christ passed within the heavenly gates, he was enthroned amidst the adoration of the angels. As soon as this ceremony was completed, this ceremony, notice that, the Holy Spirit descended upon the disciples in rich currents, and Christ was indeed glorified, even with the glory which he had with the Father from all eternity. The Pentecostal outpouring was heaven's communication that the Redeemer's inauguration was accomplished. Do you see? The 7 days of inaugurating the earthly sanctuary had their reality in the heavenly sanctuary. What is done proleptically on earth is not valid unless there is a real event there, and the real event was there. Heaven's communication at the Redeemer's inauguration was accomplished. According to his promise, he had sent the Holy Spirit from heaven to his followers as a token that he had, as priest and king, received all authority in heaven and on earth, and was the anointed one over his people. Does the sanctuary have a place in the grand design of God? Most assuredly it does. Can we get along without it? Most assuredly we cannot. If we say there is no priestly ministry of Christ today in the heavenly sanctuary, we destroy all of that. All of those sacrifices are totally without meaning unless there is the reality there. That which is done proleptically has no validity unless there is a real event to come. Because that which is done proleptically is treating a future event as if it had already happened. The sanctuary doctrine has its place in the grand design, folks. It's very, very essential place. It's very, very assured place. Now, I promised to come back. I guess I'll have to work this in tomorrow. They're telling me the time is up. Well, that's the way life is in this world. I have something more I want to show you here. I'll try to work it in tomorrow so that we don't lose out on that, because it's also important and very inspiring, I think. But as of now, let's just settle our minds forever that the sanctuary doctrine is exactly what we were told it was. It's the foundation of our faith. It's the very heart and soul of our message, and it is part of God's grand design. God bless you. To link this message to the previous one, in which we placed emphasis upon the fact that the devil is able to lead the greatest minds astray. I'm holding in my hand here 2 books. This one is called Perfection, and the subtitle is Perfection, the Impossible Possibility. And we have the names of 4 scholars in this book, and the